You know, there are some moments in your life, right, where you make a promise to yourself so deep, so fundamental, it rewires you. It's not a resolution, it's a reforging. For me, that moment came 6 years ago, staring at my parents' house in the rearview mirror as I drove away with everything I owned crammed into my beat-up car. I swore I'd never let anyone make me feel that small again. That worthless. That disposable. And that if I ever came back, it would be on my terms. And they would finally understand exactly what they'd thrown away. And it's funny because just hours before that, I was sitting in our favorite Italian spot, the engagement ring burning a hole in my jacket pocket, ready to ask Chloe to marry me. A 2-carat diamond I'd saved 8 months for, meticulously planned. Then, out of nowhere, she just slid a manila folder across the table, not gently, but like she was throwing darts. Printed screenshots scattered across the white tablecloth like little paper grenades. Your brother, Brendan, showed me everything, she said, her voice cracking, and I just sat there, my hand halfway to my pocket where the ring box was, watching her jab her finger at photos. Photos of me, supposedly, wrapped around some woman at a bar I'd never even been to. Brendan, he was always Eleanor's golden child. The one she practically fawned over, despite his string of failed businesses, the maxed-out credit cards. But I never, not for a second, thought he'd fabricate an entire cheating scandal just to destroy me. And honestly, I should have seen it coming. That was our whole childhood. When I was 7 and Brandon was 10, he broke my Nintendo. Told Eleanor I'd done it myself. And she believed him, without question. Made me apologize to him while he just smirked behind her back. Later, when I was 14, I saved up every penny from mowing lawns, bought myself a guitar. He borrowed it without asking. Left it in his friend's garage, and it got stolen. Eleanor told me I should have been more responsible, more careful. Every achievement I ever had? Minimized. Or reframed as just pure luck. While Brandon's failures? Oh, those were learning experiences. And Eleanor's eyes would just glaze over with this protective love whenever she looked at him, like he could do no wrong, even when he was clearly, obviously in the wrong. Chloe was still talking, words coming faster now, angrier. I caught fragments about how Brandon had warned her months ago that I might be unfaithful. And the pieces started clicking in my head, like a puzzle I desperately didn't want to solve. A month earlier, at her birthday party, Brendan had shown up 3 hours late, clearly intoxicated, stumbling through my parents' backyard with a gift bag that probably cost more than my entire contribution. I'd watched him corner Chloe by the dessert table. Watched him lean in too close. When I'd asked her about it later, she just brushed it off. He'd even made a toast that night, raised his beer bottle high, and announced to everyone, some guys work hard, others work smart, staring directly at me. And Eleanor had actually applauded. I remember that familiar burn of humiliation in my chest. Now Chloe was standing up, her chair scraping loud against the floor. Other diners were starting to stare. Brendan always used to say, "You're pathetic." But I didn't believe it until that moment. Then she was just gone, pushing through the restaurant doors. And I was left sitting there with a ring in my pocket, a check for $63, and the crushing realization that I'd just lost everything. I paid the bill in a daze. Drove straight to my parents' house. Because some stupid, naive part of me still thought they'd be on my side. Still believed that family meant something more than blood and obligation. The lights were on in the kitchen when I pulled up, my old, beat-up Civic looking pathetic next to Brandon's leased BMW. I walked in through the side door, like I'd done 1,000 times before. And that's when I heard them. She bought every single screenshot. It was almost too easy. Brandon's voice carried from the kitchen, loud and celebratory. And Eleanor laughed. Actually laughed. That delighted sound I recognized from every time Brandon had pulled off some scheme growing up. I stood frozen in the doorway, watched Eleanor pour champagne into 2 glasses, cheap champagne from the bottle she kept for special occasions. And Brandon? He was grinning like he'd won the lottery. "This is better for everyone," Eleanor said, reaching over to pat his hand. And I felt something inside me crack. Something fundamental that I didn't know could break. Brendan can provide for her properly. Give her the life she deserves. And you'll find someone more on your level, eventually. The way she said it, so matter-of-fact, like she was discussing the weather or grocery lists, made it somehow worse than if she'd been angry or vindictive. Because this was just casual cruelty. Just the natural order of things in her mind, where Brendan deserved the best, and I deserved whatever was left over. I must have made some sound because they both turned. For a second, Eleanor looked almost guilty. But then her face hardened into that expression I knew so well, the one that said I was being unreasonable, oversensitive, making a big deal out of nothing. Brendan didn't even have the decency to look ashamed. He just raised his champagne glass in a mock salute. And I realized, with perfect clarity, that I was never going to get an apology. Never going to get acknowledgement. Never going to be anything but the lesser son in that house. I turned and walked out. Didn't slam the door or make a scene. Just left. And that was the last time I spoke to either of them for almost 6 years. A week later, the social media post went live. Brendan and Isabella, my ex-fiancée, smiling at the camera, her hand prominently displayed, with a ring on her finger. It took me almost a full minute to recognize it as mine, the one I'd accidentally left on Eleanor's kitchen counter that night in my shock. "What belonged to him by right is now in worthy hands," Brendan's caption read. And the comments were full of congratulations. Relatives I barely knew celebrating this new couple. And nobody, not a single person, seemed to question the timeline. Or wonder what had happened to me. I spent that entire night deleting contacts. Every family member, every mutual friend, anyone who'd liked that post or commented, congratulations. Just methodically cutting ties like I was pruning a diseased tree. By sunrise, I'd sold everything I owned that wouldn't fit in my Civic, packed one suitcase with clothes and my laptop, and transferred my savings to a new bank account my family didn't know about. The last thing I did before I drove away was look back at my parents' house one final time. And I made myself that promise. 6 years is a long time. Long enough that people stop looking for you. And I spent every single day of those years building something they could never take away from me. Something that existed purely because I willed it into existence, through 80-hour work weeks and a determination that bordered on obsession. I landed in Denver with $800 to my name. No connections, no safety net. Just a suitcase, a laptop, and this burning need to prove that I was worth something. That their assessment of me had been catastrophically wrong. I worked construction during the day, the kind of backbreaking labor that left my hands blistered and bleeding, carrying lumber in the Colorado heat that hit 105 degrees by noon. And then I'd come back to my efficiency apartment and code until 3 in the morning, teaching myself advanced programming through free online courses and sheer, stubborn refusal to quit. My first breakthrough came 8 months in, a small contract building a website for a local restaurant chain. $3,000 that felt like winning the lottery. And instead of celebrating, I went straight to a used electronics store and bought a server. A hulking black tower that took up half my kitchen counter. Lucent tech started in that kitchen. Lines of code written while I ate ramen for the 4th night in a row. And slowly, painfully slowly, I built something that actually worked. A project management platform that was cleaner and faster than anything else on the market. The first year, I made $40,000, barely enough to live on. But the second year? I made $200,000. And the third year, I broke $1 million. I remember pulling over on the highway because my hands were shaking too badly to drive safely. Most people who make their first $1 million go out and buy a watch or a car, something visible to prove they've made it. But I'd spent 6 years becoming invisible. Deliberately staying off social media, using an LLC to keep my name off public records. I just rolled that money back into the company. Hired 3 developers who were smarter than me, rented actual office space. By year 4, Lucent Tech had 20 employees and contracts with mid-sized companies across the Southwest. And I was the CEO nobody had ever heard of. The ghost in the machine who showed up to exactly 0 networking events and conducted every meeting over video calls with my camera off. I never looked them up. Never searched for Brandon, or Eleanor, or Isabella on social media. Never let myself wonder if they thought about me. Because that way lay madness. And I had work to do. But in year 5, I hired a private investigator. Told myself it was just due diligence. But really, I just needed to know. The report came back thick with printouts and photographs. I read it in my office after everyone had gone home. And every page was more satisfying than the last, in the most vindictive way possible. Brandon had burned through our father's inheritance in 18 months. Lost it gambling on sports, betting, and cryptocurrency schemes. And now he was living in my old childhood bedroom with Isabella and their 2-year-old daughter, Lily, in a house that was falling apart because Eleanor couldn't afford repairs. She was working 2 jobs, morning shift at a grocery store, and evening shift doing data entry from home. 63 years old and supporting 3 adults plus a toddler because Brandon couldn't hold down employment. Kept getting fired for showing up late, or arguing with managers, or just not showing up at all. The house I'd grown up in had 3 liens against it. The roof was visibly sagging in the photos. And Eleanor's car was a 15-year-old sedan held together with hope and duct tape. Brandon's leased BMW? Repossessed 14 months ago. I sat with that report for hours. And I kept waiting to feel guilty, or sad. Kept expecting some surge of familial obligation. But all I felt was this cold, clear satisfaction. Like watching dominoes fall in exactly the pattern you'd predicted. The absolute kicker came 6 months later when an application landed on my HR manager's desk, forwarded to me with a note. It was Brandon's resume. Submitted through a recruiting agency that had no idea who owned Lucent Tech. And I've never laughed harder, or felt more vindicated, in my entire life. He'd listed himself as a senior project manager at companies I'd worked at, taking credit for projects I'd built, claiming expertise in technologies he definitely didn't understand. And his cover letter was this masterpiece of unearned confidence about how he was accustomed to success and required competitive compensation reflective of his value. I scheduled a video interview personally. Kept my camera off, disguised my voice slightly. And watched him preen and posture for 45 minutes, talking about achievements he'd stolen from my life. When he mentioned that his younger brother had never really understood business, I had to mute myself to keep from responding. The rejection email went out the same day, professional and bland. And I wondered if he even connected it. If some part of his brain registered that he'd just been turned down by the little brother he'd destroyed. The letter from Eleanor arrived on a Wednesday in November, forwarded 3 times because she'd sent it to my old address. The envelope was the cheap kind from dollar stores, my name written in her shaky handwriting. Inside was a single page about a family reunion she was planning. How it had been too long. How Brandon had really matured and wanted to help me get my life on track. Had big plans he wanted to share. And she hoped I'd put aside my pride and come home, because family was supposed to forgive. I read it 3 times, standing in my downtown condo that cost more per month than she made in 6. And I made a decision that was probably petty, and definitely vindictive, but felt absolutely right in my bones. The next morning, I bought a black Lamborghini Urus. $220,000, paid in cash. And that same afternoon, I had my lawyer finalize the purchase of Eleanor's mortgage debt from the bank. Buying it at a discount because they were tired of dealing with missed payments and liens. And just like that, I became their landlord. Their creditor. The person who literally owned the roof over their heads. The reunion was set for a Saturday in May. I drove the 12 hours from Denver to my hometown with the windows down, the engine purring like a predator. Every mile felt like putting on armor, preparing for a battle I'd been training for through 6 years of deliberate transformation. I Pulled into the parking lot at exactly 2 o'clock in the afternoon, precisely on time. The sound of the Lamborghini's engine cut through the ambient noise of the gathering like a chainsaw through butter. Made every single head turn in unison. I'd worn a suit that cost $11,000, charcoal gray with subtle pinstripes. Italian leather shoes that probably cost more than Eleanor's monthly mortgage payment. I stepped out of the car, moving with the kind of confidence that comes from knowing exactly who you are and what you're worth. The silence that fell over the reunion was absolutely delicious. Eleanor recovered first, came bustling over with her arms outstretched, talking about how good I looked while simultaneously assuming out loud that I must have rented the car. Because, of course, she couldn't imagine I'd actually earned this. That success could belong to me, rather than being some elaborate costume I'd borrowed for the afternoon. I didn't correct her. Just smiled, this tight, professional smile I'd perfected in business meetings, and made small talk with relatives who'd commented congratulations on Brendan's engagement announcement 6 years ago, who'd never once reached out to ask if I was okay. The party had been going for about 40 minutes when I heard the sound that made everything worth it. This coughing, sputtering engine noise that got louder until a rust-eaten minivan lurched into the parking lot, smoke literally pouring from under the hood. It shuddered to a stop at the far end of the lot like it had died mid-journey. Brendan climbed out first, and the contrast was so stark it almost felt staged. Him in a wrinkled polo shirt that had visible stains, khaki shorts that had seen better days. Sweating profusely, wiping his face with his forearm. And when he saw the Lamborghini, his entire body language changed. Shoulders hunching slightly, like he'd been physically struck. Isabella emerged next, looking a decade older than she should have, her hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, wearing a discount store dress. She was carrying their daughter, Lily, maybe 3 years old now, a little girl who started whining immediately about the heat. And I watched Isabella's face as she registered me standing there in my expensive suit next to my expensive car. Watched something die behind her eyes. Brendan tried to swagger over. Tried to reclaim some of his old confidence. But it was like watching someone perform a role they'd forgotten the lines to. He clapped me on the shoulder with forced enthusiasm, making jokes about me playing dress-up and finally getting some ambition. His voice too loud, trying to control the narrative the way he always had. The family dinner happened under a pavilion Eleanor had reserved. I sat at the head of one table because Eleanor had insisted, and Brendan sat across from me with Isabella beside him, looking like she wanted to disappear into the ground. Lily was fussy and tired, kept knocking over cups and crying. Brendan launched into the speech about his current venture, some multi-level marketing thing that was obviously a pyramid scheme, talking about how he was going to teach me about real business. And Eleanor was nodding along like he was dispensing profound wisdom. Then she turned to me with this expectant look and told me I should apologize to Brendan for leaving the way I did, for abandoning the family when they needed me. The audacity of it actually made me laugh out loud. The words hung in the air, so absurd that I couldn't contain my reaction. Not a polite chuckle, but a real laugh. Everyone at the table went quiet. And that's when I saw Isabella's hand move to her purse. Saw her pull out a phone that wasn't hers, Brendan's phone. Her hands were shaking as she unlocked it and stood up abruptly. I can't do this anymore. I can't watch this. Her voice came out raw and broken. She turned the phone screen toward everyone at the table, showing old text messages. Conversations between Brendan and his friends where he bragged about manipulating the screenshots, about how easy it had been to Photoshop me into compromising situations, about how he'd convinced her I was cheating because he'd wanted her for himself. Eleanor's face went white, absolutely bloodless. Brendan lunged for the phone, but Isabella jerked it away. The silence was so complete, I could hear traffic from the highway half a mile away. And Isabella kept talking, words spilling out like she'd been holding them in for years. Describing how Brendan had pursued her after our breakup. How he promised her everything and delivered nothing. How they'd been living in my childhood bedroom for 4 years because he couldn't provide for his own family. How he gambled away every paycheck. How Eleanor enabled him constantly. She was sobbing now, Lily confused and crying, too. And Brandon just sat there, his mouth opening and closing like a fish drowning in air. I let it play out. Let the truth settle over the gathering like fallout. Then I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out the folder I'd prepared. Set it on the table with deliberate care. Every eye tracked the movement like I was pulling a weapon. Inside were 3 sets of documents, paper-clipped separately. I slid the first set across to Brandon and explained calmly that he'd applied to my company, that I owned Lucent Tech. That he'd listed my achievements as his own, and lied about basically everything in his resume. And that I'd personally conducted his interview without him ever realizing he was talking to his little brother. His face went through several colors, red to white to gray. And Eleanor was shaking her head like she could deny reality through sheer force of will. But I wasn't done. I slid the second set of papers to her. The mortgage documents, showing that I now owned her debt. That I bought it from the bank. That I was legally her creditor and could foreclose whenever I wanted. And I told her she'd missed 6 payments in the last year, that the bank had been 90 days from foreclosing before I intervened. The third set of papers I kept in my hand, just held them where Isabella could see. And I pulled out a business card, slid it across the table to her. Explained it was a divorce attorney I'd vetted personally, someone who did pro bono work for women escaping financial mistreatment. You weren't on my level because you deserved better than what I could offer then, but you definitely deserved better than what he's given you, I said. And her eyes met mine for the first time in 6 years. I saw recognition there. Regret. Understanding that she'd traded something real for fool's gold. Brandon finally found his voice, started sputtering about family loyalty, about how I was being vindictive and cruel. And Eleanor joined in, her voice shrill and defensive, calling me heartless, saying this wasn't how family treated each other. The irony was so thick I could taste it. I stood up, straightened my jacket, and looked around at the relatives who'd gathered closer to watch the drama unfold. And I told them the whole story. Explained methodically how they'd fabricated evidence to destroy my engagement, stolen my ring. How Eleanor had celebrated my devastation because she thought Brandon deserved Isabella more than I did. And I watched the crowd's expressions shift from confusion to horror, to disgust. Eleanor was crying now, reaching for me with shaking hands. But I stepped back, kept that professional distance. I told her I wasn't foreclosing. That I wasn't actually a monster, despite what they tried to make me. That the mortgage payments were reasonable, and she could afford them if Brandon got a job and contributed. If she stopped enabling him and made him be an actual adult for once in his privileged, wasted life. Then I turned to Brandon one last time. Looked at this person who'd been the boogeyman of my childhood and young adulthood. And he looked so small now, so pathetic. Sweating in his stained polo shirt while his life fell apart in real time. And I felt nothing. Not anger, or satisfaction, or pity. Just a vast emptiness where he used to live in my head. Family is everything, I said, my voice steady and final. But you're not my family anymore. You lost that when you decided to destroy me for sport. I walked back to the Lamborghini while Brandon shouted after me. Incomprehensible words that might have been apologies or threats or pleas. While Eleanor wailed about how I was tearing the family apart, like she hadn't done exactly that 6 years ago with champagne and celebration. I got in my car, started the engine, felt that powerful rumble through my entire body like a heartbeat. In the rearview mirror, I could see them getting smaller. Isabella standing apart from Brandon now, with Lily on her hip. Eleanor collapsed on a bench with relatives hovering around her, uncertain how to comfort someone who'd just been exposed so completely. And Brandon just standing in the middle of the parking lot looking lost. Looking like someone who'd finally run out of people to blame. I pulled out onto the highway, heading back to Denver. Back to my life. Back to the empire I'd built from absolute nothing. The last thing I saw before they disappeared completely was Isabella looking down at the business card I'd given her, turning it over in her hands like it was a life raft. And I hoped, genuinely hoped, that she'd use it. That she'd get out before Brandon dragged her down any further. Because nobody deserved to waste their life on someone who would never, ever be worth it. And I should know. Because I'd spent too many years trying to earn love from people who were fundamentally incapable of giving it freely. So, tell me, was it too much?